Welcome, my name is Tom. This is the second video in our Trinity Chess series, and I'm excited about this one because we're actually going to set the game up. I'm going to give you some of the rules and teach how to play. The first thing that needs to be understood, the premise of the game, is that pieces are always either empowered or defenseless. Right now, every piece on the board is considered defenseless. What does that mean? Well, it means that they can't move. Until a card is put in play that will empower a piece, pieces are unable to move. Also, if you were to capture a defenseless piece, they don't score points. There are two win conditions. Either checkmate your opponent, score 15 points. Each of the pieces has a point value that's listed on the card. Pawns are worth 1 point. Knights and bishops are worth 2 points. Rooks are worth 3 points. The queen is worth 4. And the king card is worth 5. And I'll explain to you about the king card in just a minute. This is the light side, this is the shadow side. To determine who goes first, it's based on how many universal cards there are. I mean this, the first card dealt is the 6th pawn of light. Now that does not mean that only the 6th pawn can move, that means that every light pawn is now empowered. One card empowers every pawn. Let's go with the second universal card, it's the 5th pawn of shadow. So to start the game, every shadow pawn is empowered. And the third is the rook of shadow. So, both rooks are empowered on the rook side. These are considered the universal cards. How we determine who goes first is whichever side has less cards in the beginning in the universal. There's a slight disadvantage to not have, because shadow has more pieces empowered. They have a slight advantage. So, the light side goes first. We're going to deal 5 cards, 2, 3, 4, to light, and then we're going to deal 5 cards to shadow. The remaining cards become the discard pile. And that's it. The game is set up. All right, so let me give you the setup. We're currently in the 4th turn of the game. And the pieces that are in play, the 2nd pawn of light has empowered all the light pawns. The 1st bishop of light has empowered both light bishops. The 2nd knight of light has empowered both light knights. My opponent has his knights, bishops, pawns, and rooks all in play. They're all empowered. So those pieces can move. So turns are divided into 4 phases. And the first, and it's easy to remember if you just think of the word dumb, D-U-M-B. D-U-M-B stands for draw, use, move, burn. Draw, use, move, burn. At all times, there will be 3 universal cards, and each player can have a total of 5 cards, divided between in hand and in play. I have 2 cards in play, the bishop and the 2nd pawn of light, 3 cards in my hand, 5 total cards. The only exception to the 5-card rule is if I were to put another card in play. You can only have a maximum of 3 cards in play, 3 universal cards, 3 maximum player cards, and then you're allowed to draw an extra card to give you 6 total cards. So you have 3 in play and 3 in your hand. Now, if one of your pieces is captured, that's empowered, and one of these is removed, you can't draw another card because you're going to have 2 in play and 3 in your hand. Now, the next turn, if you put one in play, then you could draw an extra card. So let's go with the turns. Draw is the first one. Now, each phase is optional. You don't have to put a card in play. You don't have to draw. You don't have to move. And in some cases, you wouldn't be able to burn because you don't have a match, okay? But it's always to your advantage to draw, because part of the strategy to the game is learning how to cycle your cards to have the cards that you want, because you have to maintain a balance. You need to have cards that you can put in play that are offensive so that you can move and attack and potentially be aggressive, but you also want to have some of your defenders' more powerful cards where if they have something in play, you can match it, create a burn, and take a piece. So you have to combine the 2, cycle the cards. So let's draw. All right, so this card is not a necessarily useful card, so I'm going to discard that one, okay? Because you can only have 5 cards. Now we're on the use phase. Use phase is for me to put a card in play. Now I have some cards that I could put in play, but I don't want to, so I'm not going to. It's kind of a 2-edged sword when you put a card in play. Yes, it will empower your piece, but it also becomes a target. If your opponent has that card, they can match it and burn it, and maybe they'll cycle through and get rid of that card. So you kind of want to keep things close to the vest. Play cards when you need them, so you have the ability to ambush pieces, to bluff, and we'll get to that. Those are some of the more advanced techniques and strategies to the game. So, my use phase I'm not going to do. I'm not putting anything in play. So now it's my move phase. Now let me explain something else. There were 2 win conditions. Checkmate your opponent and a score of 15 points. Well, how do you score points? You score points by capturing empowered pieces. What does that mean? That means that if the piece is empowered and can move and I capture it, I get to not only take the piece, but I get to take its empowering card off the board. Put the piece on top of it. So let's just do that. So my bishop is empowered. It's here. I'm going to move here and capture this pawn. And I'm going to remove the pawn card from the game, set it to the side, put the pawn on top of it. That's how you can tell that a captured piece gave a point. Now let's say that it was my turn and I went to take this pawn later on, but there was no pawn card. It's not empowered. Well, then I just put it to the side here, and there's no card underneath it. That signifies that it wasn't worth any points. When I took it, it was not empowered. It was defenseless. So that's my move phase. That's how you get points. And now we talk about card replacement. Anytime you're playing the game and you either have a match or something happens and a card's removed from the board, players always have to have at least 5 cards. 6 cards if they have 3 in play. Universal cards are always replaced first. So the first thing that gets done after I've removed that pawn piece is that card gets replaced. And it is the 3rd pawn of light. So now there's another pawn in play, potentially 2 for burn. That could be burned. If my opponent has the 3rd pawn of light, the 2nd pawn of light, they can burn it. Now let's talk about burns. So we've done draw, use, move, and now we're in the burn phase. If one of my cards matches one of my opponent's cards, I can play it, take the card, and then capture the corresponding piece and receive the points. The other way to get a match is if I were to have 2 in hand. So let's say that I had 2 cards here that matched. I could play them both. I don't have to match a card that's in play. I can have the match in my hand. Now in this case, it just so happens that I have the Rook of Shadow card. And my opponent in the Universal Cards has a Rook of Shadow. So in my burn phase, I'm going to remove the Rook of Shadow, place it to the side, and now I get to choose. So which one am I going to take? I will take this one that's closest to the king, the castling rook. So now I have 3 points and 1 point. I have 4 points towards the 15-point win condition. Every piece on the board has 2 cards that correspond to it. And the king card is worth 5. I say the king card instead of the king piece is worth 5 is because there's a rule called the Divine Right of Kings. And what the Divine Right of Kings states is that, let's imagine, for instance, that I had 2 King of Shadow cards. I had both of my opponent's King of Shadow cards. I can play those and create a match, but the Divine Right of Kings says that kings can't be burned. So what does that mean? Well, it means that I can choose any other piece of my opponent's and burn instead of the king. But it still yields, because on the king card it says the kings are worth 5 points. That captured piece will then give me 5 points. Now, you say, well, that's obvious. If the opponent's queen is up, you're going to take the opponent's queen. Not necessarily. And here's the reason why you may consider not taking the opponent's queen. A captured queen is worth 4 points. If I were to get the queen cards, capture my opponent's queen, I would get 4 points. The 2 king cards generate 5 points. So you want to take a queen, or if you're trying to hit the 15-point win condition, keep in mind I already have 3 points for this rook, 1 point for this pawn, and if I had the 2 king cards, I could capture an opponent's pawn. Let's say that we're in the burn phase and I played the 2 king cards and I captured this pawn. Well, the pawn's removed, placed on top of the cards, but that pawn now yields me 5 points, whereas it would have yielded 1. And then I would have 5, 6, 7, 8, I would have 9 points. I would be close to the win condition of the 15 points. So you don't necessarily want to burn your opponent's queen. But if the queen were to get removed, that obviously makes my opponent slightly less powerful. So let's replace this universal card. And then after I did my burn phase, let's put them back now, since I didn't actually have that. That was just for example purposes. And that's how the turns work. Now, we replace the universal card. The next card that gets replaced, I have 2 cards in my hand because I used one of my rook cards to capture and burn the rook. So I need to replace that card, and now my turn is over. It's my opponent's turn to draw, use, move, burn. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea how to play Trinity Chess. It is a game that's simple to learn. You can be playing it almost immediately, but it's relatively complex in terms of the strategies. For instance, obviously the queen is the most powerful piece. Let's say that my opponent has 2 cards in play, 3 cards in hand. Let's say that one of those cards were the Queen of Shadow. Well, just in playing the game, by not immediately playing as Queen of Shadow, if the Queen of Shadow were on the board, I wouldn't have made this move to take this pawn, because I wouldn't want to give up my bishop, obviously, and the points for it. So it was to my opponent's advantage to hold on to the Queen of Shadow until an opportune time to play it. We call that an ambush. That's just one of the strategies from the game. So obviously my opponent can play his their Queen of Shadows now, take my bishop, and be on the board, and we're off and running. And that's it for now. Thanks, and I'll see you on the 3rd video where we talk a little bit more in depth about burns and why you might want to burn your own piece.